you kill your husbands? No. Did you bury them? I didn't do anything. The jury says otherwise. February 24, 2000. Huntsville, Texas. At exactly 6:18 in the evening, a 62-year-old grandmother with silver hair lay strapped to a cold metal table. Her name was Betty Lou Beets, but to the world she was known by something much darker, the Black Widow. If you saw her on the street, you'd never suspect a thing. She looked like the kind of woman who would bake cookies for the church bake sale or knit sweaters for her grandchildren. She had 5 kids, a soft voice, and the face of someone's sweet granny. But the state of Texas knew the truth, and the truth was buried 6 feet under her flower beds. The room was silent except for the hum of machines. Guards stood at attention. Witnesses watched through a glass window, their faces pale and still. Betty didn't say a word. No final apology. No tearful confession. She simply closed her eyes as the chemicals began to flow through the tubes taped to her arm. But let me take you back. Back to a quiet little town called Gun Barrel City, where Betty lived in a small house with a pretty yard. She had flowers, a decorative wishing well, and a garage that sat on a concrete slab. It looked like any other home in Texas. Except it wasn't, because underneath that wishing well, police found something that made even seasoned detectives turn away in horror. A body, wrapped in a sleeping bag, rotting in the Texas heat. It was her husband, Jimmy Don Beets, the man who had mysteriously disappeared years earlier while fishing on Cedar Creek Lake. And that wasn't all. When they started digging under the garage, they found another one. Another husband. Another body. Another life she'd snuffed out like a candle. So the question everyone wanted answered was this: was Betty Lou Beets a victim who finally snapped after years of abuse? Or was she a cold-blooded killer who turned her backyard into a graveyard, collecting insurance checks while her husbands rotted beneath the dirt? As the lethal injection stopped her heart that February night, the answer went with her. But her story? That's just beginning. August 6, 1983. The sun was just starting to rise over Cedar Creek Lake, casting orange and pink streaks across the water. It should have been a peaceful morning. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Texas for years. A fisherman spotted something strange floating near the shore. A boat. Empty. The motor was still running, puttering away like it was waiting for someone to come back. But nobody was there. The fishing poles were still set up. A tackle box sat open on the seat. Even a half-eaten sandwich was lying on the dashboard, like whoever was there had just stepped away for a second. But they never came back. The boat belonged to Jimmy Don Beets, a 46-year-old fire chief who lived in Gun Barrel City with his wife, Betty Lou. Jimmy Don was the kind of man everyone knew. He wore a badge. He saved lives. He was a hero to the community. And now he was gone. When the police called Betty Lou to tell her the news, she fell apart. At least that's what it looked like. She cried and screamed and collapsed into the arms of her daughter. "Where is he?" she sobbed. "What happened to my husband?" The neighbors rushed over to comfort her. They brought casseroles and flowers. "Poor Betty," they whispered. She'd already been through so much in her life. Search teams scoured the lake for days. Divers went down into the dark, murky water looking for a body. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers walked the shoreline calling Jimmy Don's name. But they found nothing. It was like he'd simply vanished into thin air. Betty played the role of the grieving widow perfectly. She gave tearful interviews to local news stations, begging anyone with information to come forward. She held a memorial service even though there was no body to bury. And quietly, very quietly, she began the process of collecting on Jimmy Don's life insurance policy. Months passed, then a year, then 2. People started to forget about Jimmy Don Beets. The case went cold. The file gathered dust in some detective's cabinet. And Betty Lou? She went on living in that little house in Gun Barrel City, tending to her flowers and her decorative wishing well. But someone hadn't forgotten. Someone knew the truth, and they were about to make a phone call that would change everything. Before we proceed, please kindly hit the subscribe button and also leave a comment to let us know the country you are watching from and what you think about this story. Summer, 1985. 2 years had passed since Jimmy Don disappeared. Betty Lou had moved on with her life. or at least that's what everyone thought. She still lived in the same house, still smiled at the neighbors, still played the part of the sweet old lady who'd lost her husband to a tragic accident. But then the phone rang at the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. The voice on the other end was nervous, shaky. It was someone who knew Betty, someone close to her, and they had a secret that had been eating them alive for 2 long years. "You need to check her yard," the voice said. "The wishing well. That's where he is." The detective who took the call felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be true? Could a grandmother really have murdered her husband and buried him in her own backyard? It seemed impossible. But in Texas, stranger things had happened. They got a search warrant. On the morning they arrived, Betty was home, watering her roses like it was just another normal day. She didn't seem surprised to see them. She didn't run or scream or put up a fight. She just stood there watching as the police started digging around her decorative wishing well. The well was pretty, painted white with flowers carved into the wood. It looked like something you'd see in a fairy tale. But there was no water in it, and there never had been. The officers started pulling up dirt. One shovelful, then another, then another. The deeper they dug, the worse the smell became. There was the smell of death, thick and rotten, hanging in the hot Texas air. One officer had to step away to throw up. Another covered his face with a handkerchief. And then they found it, a sleeping bag, wrapped tight with rope. And inside that sleeping bag was what was left of Jimmy Don Beets. He hadn't drowned in Cedar Creek Lake. He'd never even made it to the water that day. He'd been shot in the back of the head, wrapped up like garbage, and dumped into a hole in his own backyard. Betty Lou Beets was arrested on the spot. But as they led her away in handcuffs, one detective couldn't shake a terrible thought. If she'd done this once, had she done it before? And if so, where were the other bodies? They were about to find out. The discovery of Jimmy Don's body sent shockwaves through Gun Barrel City. How could this be real? How could a grandmother murder her husband and bury him under a wishing well? But the nightmare was only just beginning, because now the police had a new question. If Betty killed Jimmy Don, who else might be buried in that yard? Detectives started digging through Betty's past, and what they found made their blood run cold. Jimmy Don wasn't her first husband. He wasn't even her second or third. Betty Lou Beets had been married 5 times. And some of those husbands had disappeared under very strange circumstances. One name kept coming up in the files: Doyle Wayne Barker. He'd been Betty's 4th husband, and he'd vanished back in 1981, 2 years before Jimmy Don. The official story was that Doyle had run off and abandoned her. Betty said he was a drunk and a troublemaker, and she was better off without him. Everyone believed her. After all, she seemed so sweet, so helpless. But now, with Jimmy Don's body cooling in the morgue, investigators weren't so sure. They came back to Betty's house with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They scanned every inch of that property, looking for disturbed soil, unusual readings, anything that might point to another grave. And they found something. Right under the garage, beneath a concrete slab that had been poured years earlier. The concrete had to be jackhammered up, piece by piece. It was hard, brutal work in the summer heat. But when they finally broke through and started digging into the dirt below, they hit something solid. Another body, another sleeping bag, another husband. Doyle Wayne Barker had been shot in the head just like Jimmy Don. He'd been buried right there, under the garage floor, and Betty had poured fresh concrete over him like he was nothing more than a crack that needed filling. 2 husbands, 2 bullets, 2 graves. The sweet little grandmother wasn't just a killer. She was a serial killer. And her backyard had become her own personal cemetery, a place where inconvenient husbands went to disappear forever. As the news spread, the whole country started asking the same question. How many more were there? To understand how Betty Lou Beets became a killer, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when she was just Betty Lou Dunavant, a young woman trying to survive in a world that wasn't kind to her. Betty was born in 1937 in North Carolina. Her childhood was rough. She grew up poor, and by all accounts, she suffered abuse at the hands of her father. When she was just 15 years old, she married her first husband, Robert Branson, hoping to escape. But instead of finding freedom, she found more pain. Robert was violent. He hit her. He controlled her. And when she finally left him, she took their kids and ran. Husband number 2 was Jimmy Lane. That marriage didn't last either. Then came Bill Lane, husband number 3. More abuse. More fear. More running. By the time Betty was in her 40s, she'd been married and divorced 3 times, and she had 5 children who'd seen more violence than any kid should ever witness. Then came Doyle Wayne Barker in 1978. Betty seemed happy at first, but it didn't take long for things to turn sour. Doyle drank too much. He was mean. He threatened her. At least that's what Betty claimed. In 1981, Doyle mysteriously disappeared. Betty told everyone he'd left her. She threw a party to celebrate her freedom. And quietly she collected his life insurance money. 2 years later, she married Jimmy Don Beets. He was a fire chief, a respected man, someone who seemed safe. But Betty's pattern was already set. She'd learned something from her past marriages. Dead husbands were more profitable than divorced ones. Jimmy Don had good insurance. He had a pension. And Betty had a plan. In August 1983, she lured him to Cedar Creek Lake, telling him they were going fishing. But he never made it onto the water. She shot him in the back of the head, dumped his body in the wishing well, and set his boat adrift to make it look like an accident. But here's the thing that made investigators' skin crawl. Betty didn't just kill 2 husbands. She'd also shot another 1 year earlier, husband number 2, Jimmy Lane, claiming it was self-defense. He survived, but the pattern was clear. Betty Lou Beets didn't just have bad luck with men. She was hunting them. The trial of Betty Lou Beets began in October 1985, and the whole state of Texas was watching. The courthouse in Gun Barrel City was packed with reporters, curious locals, and family members from both sides. Everyone wanted to see the grandmother who'd turned her backyard into a graveyard. Betty sat at the defense table wearing a simple dress and her reading glasses, looking every bit the fragile old woman. Her lawyer knew that appearance was their best weapon. The defense strategy was simple: paint Betty as a victim, not a villain. She wasn't a cold-blooded killer, they argued. She was a battered woman who'd suffered decades of abuse and finally snapped. Her lawyer stood before the jury and told them Betty's story. The childhood abuse, the violent husbands, the broken bones and black eyes, the fear that followed her from one marriage to the next. Betty Lou Beets is not a monster, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. She's a survivor. And when Jimmy Don threatened to kill her, she did what any terrified woman would do. She defended herself. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They painted a very different picture. This wasn't self-defense, they argued. This was premeditated murder. Calculated. Driven by greed. The prosecutor stood up and pointed at Betty. This woman didn't kill out of fear. She killed for money. She shot her husband in the back of the head while he wasn't looking, wrapped him in a sleeping bag, and buried him under a wishing well. Then she cashed his insurance checks and went on with her life like nothing happened. That's not survival. That's murder. The evidence was damning. There was the life insurance money Betty had collected. There was the fact that she'd thrown a party after Doyle disappeared. There were the bullets pulled from the skulls of 2 dead men, both shot execution style from behind. And then there was the testimony from Betty's own son, Robert, who took the stand and said something that made the courtroom gasp. He admitted that he'd helped his mother bury the bodies. He was just a teenager at the time, terrified and manipulated by Betty into thinking he had no choice. He described how she'd made him dig the holes, how she'd watched coldly as they lowered the sleeping bags into the ground, how she'd threatened him into silence. The jury listened to every word. And when the prosecution rested their case, the question wasn't whether Betty had killed those men. The question was whether she deserved to die for it. The jury deliberated for hours. Outside the courthouse, people waited in the Texas heat, fanning themselves and whispering about what the verdict might be. Inside, Betty Lou Beets sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. When the jury finally came back, the courtroom fell silent. You could hear every breath, every shuffle of feet, every heartbeat. The foreman stood up, holding a piece of paper that would decide Betty's fate. We, the jury, find the defendant, Betty Lou Beets, guilty of capital murder. The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others nodded, satisfied that justice was being served. Betty didn't react. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap like she was sitting in church. But the trial wasn't over yet. In Texas, a capital murder conviction means the jury has to decide on the punishment: life in prison or death. The prosecution pushed hard for the death penalty. They reminded the jury of the 2 bodies in the backyard, the sleeping bags, the life insurance money, the cold, calculated way Betty had planned and executed her crimes. The defense begged for mercy. They brought in experts to testify about battered woman syndrome, a psychological condition where victims of long-term abuse believe they have no escape except through violence. They argued that Betty's entire life had been shaped by trauma, that she wasn't born a killer, she'd been made into one by the men who hurt her. But the jury wasn't convinced. After more deliberation, they came back with their decision. Betty Lou Beets would be executed by lethal injection. She became one of only a handful of women in Texas to receive the death penalty. Her lawyers immediately filed appeals, arguing that executing a grandmother was cruel and unusual punishment. They said she deserved life in prison, not death. But the state of Texas disagreed. As Betty was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions at her. She didn't answer. She didn't cry. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She just walked away, her head held high, as if she'd already accepted what was coming. She was going to death row. And for the next 15 years, she would sit in a cell, waiting for the day the state would finally make good on its promise to end her life. Death row for women in Texas is housed at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, about an hour north of Austin. It's a grim place, all concrete and razor wire, where time moves slowly and hope dies fast. Betty Lou Beets arrived there in 1985, and for the next 15 years, it would be her home. Life on death row is nothing like regular prison. The inmates are kept in isolation for most of the day, locked in tiny cells with barely enough room to turn around. They eat alone. They sleep alone. They wait alone. The only thing they share is the knowledge that one day the state will come for them. But Betty didn't seem fazed by it. She adapted to prison life with eerie calm, making friends with other inmates, reading books, even laughing sometimes. To the outside world, she became a symbol of the debate over the death penalty. Was it right to execute a 62-year-old grandmother? Did her history of abuse matter? Or did the 2 dead husbands in her backyard erase any sympathy she might deserve? Her lawyers filed appeal after appeal, fighting to overturn her conviction or at least reduce her sentence to life in prison. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that crucial evidence about her abuse had been excluded, that executing her would be a moral stain on the state of Texas. The case went all the way to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, then to the U.S. Supreme Court. Every time the answer was the same: denied. As the years dragged on, Betty watched other women come and go from death row. Some had their sentences reduced. Some died of natural causes before the state could execute them. But Betty's date kept getting closer. In 1998, her case landed on the desk of Texas Governor George W. Bush. By then, Bush was preparing to run for president, and the decision of whether to grant clemency to Betty Lou Beets became national news. Activists rallied outside the governor's mansion, holding signs that read, "Don't execute Grandma," and "Abuse victims deserve mercy." But victims' rights groups pushed back, saying Betty was a cold-blooded killer who deserved no sympathy. Bush reviewed the case. He read the files. He considered the arguments. And then he made his decision. The execution would proceed. Betty Lou Beets had run out of appeals. She had run out of time. All that was left now was the walk to the death chamber. February 24, 2000. Betty Lou Beets woke up in her cell knowing it would be her last day on Earth. She was 62 years old. She'd spent 15 years on death row. And in less than 12 hours, the state of Texas would end her life. Prison officials asked her if she wanted a final meal. It's a strange tradition, one last act of kindness before the state takes everything away. Some inmates order elaborate feasts, steaks, lobster, desserts. Others refuse to eat at all. Betty kept it simple. She didn't ask for much, just something small and comforting. She ate quietly in her cell, alone with her thoughts. Her children had been notified. Some of them planned to be there to witness the execution. Others couldn't bear it. The family was torn apart by Betty's crimes, divided between those who believed she was a victim and those who thought she was a monster. Her son Robert, the one who'd testified against her, carried the heaviest burden. He'd helped bury those bodies. He'd lived with that secret for years before finally telling the truth. And now he had to live with knowing his testimony had helped put his own mother on death row. As the hours ticked by, Betty was moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. She was allowed a final visit from a chaplain, who prayed with her and asked if she wanted to confess her sins. What she said in that room, only the two of them will ever know. At 5 p.m., the prison officials came for her. It was time. Betty was led down a long hallway, her wrists cuffed, her feet shuffling in prison-issue slippers. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She walked like she was going to meet an old friend. The execution chamber at the Walls unit in Huntsville is a small, clinical room. There's a gurney in the center with leather straps. Windows on one side where witnesses can watch. Betty was strapped down, her arms extended, for lines inserted into her veins. The witnesses filed in, family members, reporters, prison officials. Everyone took their seats. The warden asked Betty if she had any final words. This was her last chance to speak, to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. Betty Lou Beets said nothing. She just closed her eyes. At 6:18 p.m. on February 24, 2000, the chemicals began to flow through the 4 lines taped to Betty Lou Beets' arms. First came the sedative, a drug that would make her unconscious. Then the paralytic, stopping her ability to breathe. Finally, the drug that would stop her heart. The witnesses watched in silence. Some looked away. Others stared, wanting to see justice served with their own eyes. Betty's chest rose and fell one last time. Then it stopped. 7 minutes later, the doctor stepped forward and checked for a pulse. There was none. At 6:25 p.m., Betty Lou Beets was pronounced dead. The Black Widow of Gun Barrel City was gone. Outside the prison, protesters held candles and sang hymns. Some were there to mourn Betty, believing she'd been a victim of abuse who deserved mercy. Others were there to celebrate, saying the world was safer with one less killer in it. The debate over her execution raged on long after her body went cold. Betty became only the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Her case sparked national conversations about domestic violence, the death penalty, and whether someone's past suffering should excuse their crimes. But no matter which side people fell on, everyone agreed on one thing. The story of Betty Lou Beets was a tragedy from beginning to end. Her body was cremated. Her ashes were given to her family. The house in Gun Barrel City, the one with the wishing well in the garage, was sold and eventually torn down. The new owners wanted nothing to do with the ghosts that lingered there. As for the truth, well, that died with Betty. She never confessed, never apologized, never explained why she did what she did. Was she a battered woman who finally fought back? Or was she a calculating killer who used abuse as an excuse? We'll never know for sure. What we do know is this: 2 men are dead, 2 families are shattered. And somewhere in Texas, beneath flower beds that no longer exist, the memory of their graves remains. Betty Lou Beets took her secrets to the grave, but her story? That will haunt Texas forever.